The hum of the environmental controls was the loudest sound in the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite, a low, steady thrum that always reminded me of a giant, sleeping beast. I liked it. It meant everything was contained, measured, sterile, my kind of quiet. Today, the suite's usual meticulous order was strained by the sheer volume of debris. The stainless steel tables, usually gleaming, were laden with what looked like the aftermath of a small, contained apocalypse. Charred fragments of what used to be sophisticated bioengineering equipment, twisted metal, shattered reinforced glass, and a fine, persistent dust that clung to everything like a shroud. This was Dr. Aris Thorne's lab, or what was left of it. "Morning, Reed," the detective said, his voice gravelly as he pushed a stack of preliminary reports across the table with a gloved hand. He didn't wait for a reply, already turning to gesture at the array of evidence. "Looks like a bad day at the office for Thorne. Explosion, high-yield chemical reaction probably. The fire suppression system kicked in, but not before everything went to hell." I nodded, not looking up from the microscope. My fingers, steady as always, adjusted the focus knob. The detective was a good man, pragmatic, but he saw the surface. My job was to dig deeper, to find the hidden currents beneath the visible waves. Initial assessment points to either a catastrophic miscalculation or, less likely, a suicide. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman with an impatient air, added from across the room, reviewing digital schematics on a large screen. Thorne was working on some revolutionary stuff, highly volatile, the kind of research that could, supposedly, change the world. She sounded skeptical of the world-changing part, but not of the volatility. I already had the incident reports. Read them twice on the way in. The scene photos showed devastation, a central point of origin, and the remains of Thorne himself, unfortunately, beyond recognition for anything but DNA confirmation. Everything pointed to a rapid, intense thermal event. A classic lab accident. A tragic genius hoisted by his own petard. But my gut, that persistent, irritating voice of experience, was already whispering. It wasn't a scream, not yet, just a low murmur of unease. I picked up a piece of what looked like a control panel fragment. It was mostly plastic, melted and warped into an abstract sculpture of black and gray. A few embedded wires, copper gleaming faintly through the soot, dangled like brittle vines. I turned it over in my gloved hand, feeling the rough texture, the sharp edges where the plastic had fractured under intense heat. The smell of acrid smoke and something vaguely metallic still clung to it, even days after the event. Under the bright, focused beam of my examination lamp, the charring on the panel was extensive, almost uniform. But then I saw it. Near where a bank of indicator lights would have been, a small, circular section of the plastic was burned differently. It wasn't just scorched black. It was a deeper, almost vitrified burn with a distinct, sharp edge. Like a miniature crater, only about 3 millimeters in diameter. The surrounding charring feathered out, as expected from an explosion's heat, but this little circle was too precise, too isolated. I brought it closer to my eye, then moved it under the stereo microscope. The magnification brought the detail into stark relief. The edge of the burn was almost perfectly round, and the material within it had undergone a more severe transformation than the surrounding plastic. It looked like it had been hit by something incredibly hot, incredibly localized, before the general conflagration. The plastic here was not just charred, it was almost glass-like, fused. "What do you have, Reed?" the lead investigator asked, his voice cutting through the silence. She'd probably noticed my prolonged focus on that single piece. I didn't answer immediately. My mind was racing, sifting through data, comparing this specific burn signature to others I'd cataloged over the years. A general explosion, even a high-yield chemical one, produces a more diffuse, less focused heat pattern. It would char, melt, and vaporize, but the transition zones would be gradual. This, however, was like a pinprick of pure, concentrated energy, followed by the broader destruction. "This burn pattern," I finally said, my voice quiet, almost to myself. "It's unusual." The detective grunted, glancing over. "Heat is heat, Reed. Lab full of volatile chemicals, things go boom. Not always like this," I countered, still staring into the eyepiece. "This isn't consistent with a general thermal wavefront. It's too focused, too clean in its own destructive way." I carefully rotated the fragment, observing the microscopic ripples in the vitrified plastic. "It suggests a point source, something that delivered intense, localized heat. Then the explosion. My colleague, a younger forensic chemist, leaned in, peering over my shoulder. Could be a micro-implosion or a secondary reaction. Perhaps, I conceded, though I didn't believe it. The shape, the depth, the crystalline structure of the melted plastic, it didn't fit. I'd seen high-energy laser burns, plasma torch marks, even specific types of electrical arcing leave similar signatures, but never as part of a catastrophic chemical explosion's primary evidence. This wasn't a side effect. It felt like a cause, or at least a highly specific trigger. I felt the familiar tension coil in my stomach. The case, which had seemed so straightforward, so tragic, was already beginning to fray at the edges. A tiny, almost invisible detail, a perfect circle of scorching on a melted piece of plastic, was all it took. It was enough to make me question everything. Dr. Aris Thorne's death wasn't just an accident. It couldn't be. This was something else entirely, and I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't rest until I found out what. The sterile chill of the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite always felt more profound than the cold of any morgue. Here, the air hummed with the quiet efficiency of specialized equipment, a stark contrast to the grim tableau on the stainless steel table. Dr. Aris Thorne, or what was left of him, lay beneath the surgical lights. The medical examiner, a woman with tired eyes and precise movements, began her preliminary report. Extensive thermal trauma, as expected, she stated, her voice flat, professional. 3rd and 4th degree burns covering 80% of the body. Severe charring on the torso and upper extremities. Significant inhalation injuries, soot in the airways. Carbon monoxide saturation consistent with death prior to the full extent of the fire. I leaned closer, my gaze fixed on the body. The heat had distorted much, but my eyes sought patterns, anomalies. What about the burn distribution? I asked, my voice low. Any areas disproportionately affected or spared? He adjusted his magnifying visor, his gloved fingers gently probing a section of Thorne's forearm. That's where it gets interesting, read, see here. She pointed to a patch of skin on the inner forearm near the wrist. While the surrounding tissue is carbonized, this area shows a distinct, almost geometric pattern of less severe burns. It's localized, almost like a specific, focused heat source hit here before the general conflagration. My brow furrowed. A pre-existing injury or something that happened simultaneously but independently. Hard to say definitively yet, she admitted. But it's not consistent with a uniform blast or thermal event. And then there's this. She carefully lifted Thorne's left hand, turning it over. The palm was severely burned, the fingers curled into a rigid claw, but along the edge of the index finger, barely visible, was a minute, almost iridescent shimmer. I nearly missed it, embedded in the singed tissue right under the nail bed. I pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves and reached for my forensic toolkit, selecting a pair of fine-tipped tweezers and a micro-collection vial. Under the examination suite's powerful overhead lights, the shimmer resolved into a minuscule, almost invisible fiber. It was thinner than a strand of hair, with an unusual opalescent quality. Carefully, painstakingly, I extracted it. That's not a common lab material, I observed, holding the vial up. Not from any of Thorne's documented research. Certainly not from the lab's standard safety gear or equipment. I'd seen enough synthetic polymers to recognize something new. This fiber had a distinct, almost organic sheen, yet its structure screamed artificial. It wasn't a natural fiber, nor was it any of the usual industrial synthetics. It was unique. My initial thought exactly, the medical examiner confirmed. It's being catalogued for further analysis, but it certainly doesn't fit the catastrophic accident narrative perfectly. Nothing about this fits perfectly, I muttered, more to myself than to her. The geometric burn, the peculiar fiber, they were threads unraveling the neat tapestry of a simple accident. Later that afternoon, a detective from the local precinct joined me in a small conference room down the hall from the examination suite. He was a man with a perpetually rumpled suit and a weary expression, but his notes were meticulous. We've started the preliminary interviews, he began, pushing a stack of files across the table. Mostly colleagues and staff from Thorne's facility. 2 names kept coming up, both with a history of bad blood with Thorne. I nodded, gesturing for him to continue. First, a Dr. Silas Vance. He runs a competing bioengineering lab at the university. Apparently, Thorne and Vance were old rivals. Going back to their postdoc days, Vance felt Thorne consistently stole his ideas, or at least got to them first and claimed credit. A few years back, there was a public spat over a shared grant proposal. Thorne ended up getting the lion's share of the funding. Vance was pretty vocal about Thorne's unethical research practices. I made a note. Motive: professional jealousy, intellectual property dispute. Exactly, the detective affirmed. Then there's Maya. He was Thorne's research assistant for almost 3 years. Fired unceremoniously 6 months ago. She claims Thorne denied her co-authorship on a major paper, refused to acknowledge her contributions to his groundbreaking work, and generally treated her like an indentured servant. He was apparently quite bitter about it, even threatened legal action at one point. A disgruntled former employee, I mused. Another classic. What's her full name? Maya Sharma. And her current whereabouts? She's been working freelance, consulting for a few smaller biotech startups. We've got an address and a phone number. She's agreed to come in tomorrow for a formal interview. I leaned back in my chair, the peculiar fiber still heavy in its vial in my evidence kit. Vance and Sharma, two obvious suspects, each with a clear, if common, motive. But the intricacies of Thorne's death, the subtle anomalies I'd found, suggested something far more complex than a simple act of revenge or professional sabotage. This wasn't a clumsy, angry act. This was precision. This was calculated. The tension in the room, which had been low and conversational, suddenly sharpened. I felt it, a cold prickle on my skin. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make Thorne's death look like an accident. And I had a feeling that iridescent fiber, that strange burn pattern, was just the beginning of their unraveling. The peculiar fiber, still nestled in its vial, felt like a constant weight in my evidence kit. Vance and Sharma, two names, two obvious suspects, each with a motive as old as ambition itself. But the picture forming around Thorne's death was anything but simple. The anomalies I'd found, the unusual burn pattern, the subtle discrepancies in the lab's environmental logs, they whispered of something far more intricate than a simple act of revenge or a tragic miscalculation. This was orchestrated. I was back in my element, surrounded by the hum of servers and the cool, sterile air of the FBI Forensic Science Division examinations suite. The time on the wall clock read 2:17 a.m., but the hours blurred when I was chasing a phantom. My focus was on the stack of hard drives pulled from Thorne's lab, each one a digital vault potentially holding the secrets of his final project. This wasn't just about a dead bioengineer. It was about what he was working on, something big enough to drive someone to such lengths. My fingers danced across the keyboard, navigating through layers of encryption. Thorne had been meticulous, almost paranoid about his data security. Firewalls, multi-factor authentication, custom-coded algorithms. It was a digital fortress. But I was Reed, and fortresses were meant to be breached. Hours bled into each other. My eyes, gritty from staring at glowing screens, scanned lines of code, file directories, and access logs. I started with the server hosting his primary research, the one labeled Project Chimera, in a series of alphanumeric characters Thorne probably thought only he could decipher. The sheer volume of data was staggering: genetic sequences, protein folding simulations, bioreactor telemetry, and reams of experimental data. This was advanced genetic sequencing, all right, pushing the boundaries of what I thought was possible. The implications, even at a cursory glance, were immense, a double-edged sword capable of rewriting disease or just as easily engineering a plague. Then I saw it. A series of timestamps in an archived log file that didn't quite sit right. A chunk of data, specifically within the gene expression subdirectory, showed an access time that predated the server's last verified system sync by a few microseconds. A tiny flicker, easily missed, but to my eye it was a glaring anomaly. I cross-referenced it with the network traffic logs. There, another subtle hint, a brief, encrypted outbound burst of data, too small to be a full transfer, too large to be an innocuous ping. My internal alarm bells began to clang. I dove deeper, employing specialized forensic tools to reconstruct the file system's history. And that's when the full picture began to emerge. Not just an anomaly, but a deliberate act. There were faint, almost erased, traces of sophisticated data manipulation within the core genetic sequencing files. It wasn't a simple deletion. It was an attempt at a surgical excision, a targeted removal of specific data sets, followed by an overwrite designed to look like routine system maintenance. Someone had tried to wipe a trail, to make a crucial piece of Thorne's research vanish without a trace. And they were good. Very good. My jaw tightened. This wasn't Thorne trying to hide something from the world. This was someone else trying to hide something from me. This moved the needle decisively away from suicide or accident. This was murder, cold and calculated, with a digital cleanup crew. Just as I was about to flag the specific sectors for deeper recovery, my desk phone buzzed. It was the detective. Reed, Maya, Thorne's assistant, just called. She's been a wreck since the incident. Said he had something important to tell us, but only to you. She's on her way to the facility now. I grunted, running a hand through my hair. Perfect timing. The assistant's arrival would interrupt my flow, but her insights might be invaluable, especially now that I had definitive proof of foul play. An hour later, the assistant stood awkwardly in the doorway of the suite, clutching a worn leather handbag to her chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her usually meticulous hair now disheveled. "Thank you for coming in, Maya," I said, gesturing to a chair opposite my workstation. "I appreciate you making the trip at this hour." She nodded, her gaze darting around the room, avoiding eye contact. It's about Dr. Thorne, his mind. He started encrypting everything, even things he usually left open. He was convinced they were watching him, listening. My gaze drifted to the glowing screen behind me, displaying the faint traces of the data manipulation. Did he ever mention who they were? She shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. No, just outsiders. He was so secretive, especially about Project Chimera. Said it was too important, too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. He even started carrying a burner phone, which was completely unlike him. Dangerous in what way? I pressed, my mind racing, for better or for worse. He had a meeting scheduled a week from now. With a new investor, he said, someone who could fast-track the project, but he seemed apprehensive about it. Did he mention the investor's name? She wrung her hands. No, just that they were very well connected. He was nervous, Reed, really nervous. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure the original research data, the unmodified data, got out. But he never told me where it was or how to tell if it was modified. She looked at me, a desperate plea in her eyes. He was so afraid, he said they'd stop at nothing. The unmodified data. Her words echoed in my head, confirming my suspicions. Someone had indeed been tampering with Thorne's work, and Thorne himself had been aware of the threat. His paranoia wasn't a delusion, it was a premonition. I thanked her, assuring her we would get to the bottom of it. As she left, her shoulders slumped, the weight of her fear palpable, I turned back to the screen. The evidence of the data wipe, Thorne's fear of outsiders, the dangerous nature of Project Chimera, and the mysterious, well-connected investor. This wasn't just a murder, it was a calculated strike at the heart of a world-altering discovery. The stakes had just escalated dramatically. I had to find out what Thorne was trying to hide, and who was so desperate to keep it buried. The assistant's words, unmodified data, had been a cold splash of water, jarring me out of any lingering doubt. Thorne wasn't just paranoid, he was targeted. That microscopic trace I'd found earlier, clinging to the edge of the blast zone, suddenly felt a lot heavier, a potential anchor point in this sea of fabricated chaos. I spent the next several hours holed up in the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite. Hum of the advanced spectral analysis equipment, my only company. The suite was a sterile symphony of polished steel and glowing screens, a place where the invisible became visible, where whispers of truth could be amplified into undeniable facts. My fingers, steady despite the gnawing tension in my gut, adjusted the focus, bringing the irregular speck into sharp relief on the monitor. The machine whirred to life, a low thrumming that vibrated through the floor. I initiated the feeding specific parameters into the system, hoping to unlock the secrets held within that tiny fleck. Each pulse of light, each wave of energy directed at the sample, was designed to tease out its elemental composition, to paint a chemical fingerprint. I watched the graphs crawl across the secondary screen, a kaleidoscope of peaks and valleys, each one a clue. The process was painstaking, requiring absolute precision and patience, qualities I'd cultivated over years of sifting through the aftermath of human malice. Then, a distinct pattern emerged, unmistakable to my trained eye. a series of sharp, unusual spikes that didn't align with any common lab materials, nor with typical biological or inorganic residues. My brow furrowed. I cross-referenced the signature against our extensive database of known compounds. The system churned, sifting through millions of molecular structures, polymers. Alloys a match. The name flashed across the screen: polymer, synthetic, rare earth doped. My eyes narrowed, reading the detailed specifications. This wasn't just any polymer. It was a specialized, high-performance material, incredibly durable, resistant to extreme temperatures and corrosive agents, and exceptionally difficult to synthesize. Its primary application: high-end industrial manufacturing, specifically in components designed for precision machinery and advanced robotics. This polymer had no business being in Thorne's bioengineering lab, especially not in such a specific, localized trace. It wasn't part of his usual equipment, nor was it a byproduct of his known research. This wasn't an accident. This was an implant, a foreign body introduced by design. My mind immediately leapt to the corporate entities funding Thorne's groundbreaking work. OmniCorp. They were a sprawling conglomerate, notorious for their aggressive R&D, their relentless pursuit of technological advantage. They had their fingers in everything from aerospace to advanced materials. This polymer, this rare synthetic, felt like a signature. Well, Thorne, I murmured to the empty suite, leaning back in my chair, the metal groaning softly in protest. Looks like my unmodified data wasn't the only thing they left behind. The investigation had just taken a sharp corporate turn. The initial suspects, the disgruntled colleague, the rival academic, suddenly seemed too small, too personal. I pushed away from the console, the fluorescent lights of the suite glinting off the steel surfaces. I needed to talk to OmniCorp, and I knew exactly who to start with: their liaison, the one who'd been so helpful, so eager to cooperate in the initial stages of the investigation. Too eager, perhaps. In hindsight, an hour later, I was seated in one of the small, utilitarian interview rooms just down the hall from the examination suite. The room was stark, a rectangular table dominating the space, 2 chairs on either side. The OmniCorp liaison, a man named Henderson, arrived promptly, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his smile a little too wide, a little too practiced. He carried himself with an air of confident authority, a man used to being in control. "Reed," he greeted, extending a hand that was firm, almost aggressively so. "Glad we could connect again. Any new developments on Dr. Thorne's tragic passing?" His tone was solicitous, almost overly sympathetic. "As a matter of fact, Henderson, we do have a development," I replied, my voice even, watching his eyes for any flicker of reaction. "We've identified a unique trace element at the scene. A rare, synthetic polymer. It's used primarily in high-end industrial applications, precision machinery." His smile didn't waver, but I saw a subtle tightening around his eyes, a micro-expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He leaned forward slightly, feigning interest. "Is that so? Fascinating. Thorne used in his bioengineering research, not according to his lab inventory anyway." Henderson chuckled, a light, dismissive sound. "Well, labs can be messy places, can't they? Perhaps it was tracked in, or a component from some shared equipment broke down. OmniCorp has a vast array of holdings, Reed. We deal with countless polymers, compounds. It's difficult to keep track of every microscopic speck." He waved a dismissive hand. "This isn't a speck of dust, Henderson," I countered, my gaze unwavering. "This is a specific, high-grade polymer, one that requires significant investment and specialized processes to create. OmniCorp, as I understand it, is heavily invested in advanced materials research, particularly in areas that overlap with high-precision manufacturing." He steepled his fingers, his expression shifting to one of earnest cooperation. "Of course, we're at the forefront of innovation. But to suggest this polymer, whatever it is somehow linked to Dr. Thorne's accident or even to OmniCorp's involvement seems a rather large leap, wouldn't I say? Is OmniCorp working on any projects that utilize a rare earth-doped synthetic polymer with high heat and corrosion resistance?" I asked directly, cutting through his polite evasiveness. He paused, a beat too long. "Our R&D department is constantly exploring new materials. It's a highly competitive field, Reed. We can't disclose every proprietary component. But I can assure nothing we are working on or have ever worked on would have any connection to Dr. Thorne's unfortunate demise. He offered another disarming smile. We valued Dr. Thorne immensely. His research was groundbreaking. We were very proud to fund it. And what was OmniCorp's specific interest in Dr. Thorne's project, beyond its general scientific merit? I pressed. Commercial potential, of course, Henderson replied smoothly. World-changing technology, as I know, the applications were limitless. We saw the future in his work, and we wanted to be a part of it. He sounded like he was reading from a press release. Even if that future involved a material like this polymer, I gestured vaguely. He leaned back, a picture of calm confidence. Reed, I'm here to assist in any way I can. If I have specific questions about OmniCorp's materials, I can relay them to our R&D director, but I assure I have nothing to hide. We are fully transparent. Our only interest is seeing justice served for Dr. Thorne. His words were all cooperation, but his eyes, though friendly, held a guarded quality, a subtle resistance that spoke volumes. He was a master of evasion, burying unhelpful truths under layers of helpful-sounding platitudes. He was giving me everything I asked for, except the answers. As he finally rose to leave, reiterating his availability, I knew one thing for certain. The web of connections surrounding Thorne's death had just grown infinitely more complex, and OmniCorp was right at the center of it. This wasn't just a murder, it was an industrial secret, carefully guarded, and someone was willing to kill to keep it that way. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel the weight of a powerful corporation pushing back. This was just the beginning. The rhythmic hum of the mass spectrometer was a familiar lullaby, one I often found more comforting than silence. I was deep inside the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite, the air thick with the faint scent of solvents and ozone, bathed in the cool, sterile glow of overhead fluorescence. Around me, various pieces of sophisticated equipment blinked and whirred, each a silent partner in my relentless pursuit of truth. My focus, sharp as a laser, was locked on the microscopic polymer trace I'd painstakingly isolated from the scorch marks in Thorne's lab. This wasn't just any plastic. Its molecular structure was uniquely complex, designed for extreme heat resistance and flexibility, unlike anything I'd seen in common consumer products. My initial sweeps had been fruitless, but a deeper dive into specialized databases, cross-referencing material science patents and experimental composites, was finally yielding fruit. The screen in front of me glowed with a match, an obscure entry for a prototype material developed for high-stress industrial applications, specifically for specialized robotic components used in ultra-clean environments. The material was proprietary, not commercially available, likely manufactured in extremely limited quantities by a very few specialized outfits. A cold certainty settled in my gut. This wasn't a lab accident, not a suicide. This was a deliberate act, executed with precision using a highly specialized tool, one I was now closing in on. The thought thrilled me, a jolt of pure investigative adrenaline, but it also brought with it a prickle of unease. Whoever used this material had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide their tracks, and they weren't going to appreciate me digging them up. It was well past midnight when I finally called it a night. The city outside, a quiet expanse of twinkling lights. I needed a break, a chance for my mind to process the implications of this new data. Walking from the main FBI building to my car in the dimly lit parking garage, I felt a strange, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you're being watched. Then, as I stepped onto the street, halfway to my apartment, it happened. It accelerated hard, swerving directly into my path. There was no horn, no squeal of tires until I reacted. My reflexes, honed by years of navigating chaotic crime scenes and unexpected dangers, kicked in. I dove sideways, slamming my shoulder into a rough brick wall, the asphalt tearing at my sleeve. The sedan roared past, missing me by scant inches, its engine echoing aggressively down the empty street before it vanished around the next corner. I pushed myself up, my breath catching, my shoulder aching. My mind, however, was already racing, analyzing the incident. No skid marks from the sedan, just aggressive acceleration. No attempt to brake, only to swerve back into the correct lane once it had passed me. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. A very loud, very clear message. The next morning, I arrived early at my personal workspace within the FBI building, a small, cluttered office where I kept my most sensitive case files and ongoing analyses. The air was cool, the building still quiet. I paused at the threshold. A faint, almost imperceptible scent hung in the air, something metallic, like burnt sugar, but not from my own equipment. My eyes scanned the room. Nothing seemed overtly disturbed. My laptop was where I'd left it, papers stacked neatly. But then I noticed it, a small, almost microscopic scuff mark on the polished linoleum floor just inside the doorframe. It hadn't been there yesterday. I knelt, examining it closely. It looked like a fresh drag mark, as if something heavy or someone wearing a specific type of footwear had been briefly pulled across the surface. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a message, it was a violation. Someone had been in my space. They hadn't taken anything, or at least nothing obvious. They'd simply been here. They were trying to scare me off, but they were only proving my suspicions. This wasn't a random event. The accidents were escalating because I was getting too close. I called Thorne's assistant. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight, a tremor running through him. Words. "Reed, is everything all right?" "I need to speak with I said, keeping my own voice even, reassuring. "It's important. Can I meet me for coffee away from the lab?" "I suppose so. The usual place." "Perfect." 20 minutes later, I found her tucked into a corner booth of a bustling downtown coffee shop, clutching a steaming mug with both hands. Her face was pale, eyes wide and haunted. She looked like she hadn't slept. "What's wrong?" I inquired, sliding into the opposite seat. "I look like I've seen a ghost." She took a shaky breath, her gaze darting around the cafe before settling back on me, her eyes pleading. It's not Thorne's ghost." I was so scared. "Scared of what?" I prodded gently. "Of him," she confessed, her voice barely audible over the clatter of cups. "About a week before. Before the fire, I was working late, clearing out some old files. Dr. Thorne had already left. I was heading out, and the main lab door, the one with the biometric scanner, it was ajar, just a crack. I thought Thorne had forgotten to seal it properly, which was unlike him. I pushed it open a little further to check, and I saw someone inside. My heart rate picked up. "Who?" "I don't know," she insisted, shaking her head frantically. The lights were dim. They were standing near Thorne's main workstation, hunched over something. I only saw their silhouette, tall, broad shoulders. Their head was down. They moved with purpose, very quiet. When I saw them, they froze, then quickly slipped out of sight into the back storage area. I was so startled, I just ran. I locked the door behind me and left. I told myself it was nothing, just a security guard or maybe doctor. Thorne had come back for something. But he never wore a hood in the lab, and he never left the door ajar. Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to get involved. I just wanted to forget it. But then the accident, and now I've been feeling watched too, Reed. I think someone was in the lab that night, and they weren't supposed to be. The pieces clicked into place. The specialized polymer, the near miss, the breach of my lab, and now her terrified confession. Thorne's research wasn't just groundbreaking, it was dangerous, and someone was willing to kill to get their hands on it, or to keep it secret. And they were willing to kill again to keep me from finding out who. The mystery was deepening, and the game had just turned deadly. The fluorescent hum of the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite was a familiar drone, a constant companion to my deepest dives into digital debris. I sat hunched over a bank of monitors, lines of code and data logs scrolling past my eyes like an arcane language. The air was cool, sterile, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene I'd left behind in Thorne's lab. After the near miss in my own facility, after the colleague's terrified confession, I knew I wasn't just looking for a killer. I was looking for a ghost, a phantom with an engineer's mind and a surgeon's precision. My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through terabytes of data extracted from Thorne's lab. Security camera feeds, environmental control logs, equipment telemetry, access card records, every digital footprint the facility had ever made. The initial reports screamed accident, a catastrophic failure of a containment field, followed by an atmospheric breach. But my gut and the microscopic polymer trace told a different story. I started with the environmental controls. Thorne's lab was a fortress of regulated air, temperature, and pressure. Any deviation, no matter how minor, was logged. I scrolled back to the timestamp of the incident. Nothing immediately jumped out. A gradual, almost imperceptible drop in ambient oxygen levels began about 40 minutes before the explosion. It was so slow, so subtle, it looked like a calibration drift or perhaps a minor leak. Anyone reviewing the logs casually would dismiss it. But I wasn't casual. My eyes narrowed. This wasn't a leak. The system's compensatory mechanisms, designed to maintain equilibrium, were curiously slow to react, or rather they appeared slow. Digging deeper, I found a series of micro-adjustments in the air intake manifold's flow rate, precisely counteracting the system's attempts to correct the oxygen dip. It was like watching a digital tug-of-war, with an unseen hand subtly tipping the scales. This required not just access, but an intimate understanding of the lab's bespoke atmospheric regulation protocols. Then came the equipment logs. Thorne had been working with volatile compounds, materials that reacted violently under specific conditions. I cross-referenced the oxygen dip with the operational status of his primary experimental reactor. The reactor itself seemed to be functioning within parameters. Until a specific sequence of internal pressure fluctuations began. They weren't random. They were rhythmic, building in intensity like a drumbeat leading to a crescendo. "Look at this," I muttered, leaning closer to the screen, my reflection staring back at me, tired but resolute. The internal pressure in the reactor spiked, then dropped, then spiked again, precisely when the oxygen levels reached their lowest point. A colleague, a digital forensics specialist who'd been assisting me, glanced over my shoulder. "Looks like a system overload. Read. Maybe a cascade failure triggered by the atmospheric changes." "That's what it's supposed to look like," I corrected, my voice low. "But the reactor's diagnostic logs show no pre-existing fault, and these pressure fluctuations, they're not random, they're too deliberate. It's almost as if something was priming the reactor, making it susceptible." I pulled up the network activity logs for the lab. Thorne's system was isolated, air-gapped from the main university network, a security measure he'd insisted upon. But even air-gapped systems have their vulnerabilities. And sure enough, buried within a routine software update protocol, I found it. A series of encrypted data packets, originating from an external source, had been injected into the lab's internal network roughly an hour before the incident. They masqueraded as a patch for the environmental controls, but their true payload was far more sinister. My fingers trembled slightly as I traced the digital breadcrumbs. This wasn't just remote access, it was a ghost in the machine. The packets contained a series of timed commands. First, to subtly depress the oxygen levels in the lab, bypassing the safety protocols. Second, to initiate the precise, rhythmic pressure fluctuations within Thorne's experimental reactor. And third, the final, fatal command, a localized energy surge directed at the reactor's containment field, designed to coincide with the critical atmospheric and internal pressure conditions. It clicked. The microscopic polymer trace I'd found near the reactor, it wasn't from the reactor itself. It was residue from a small, highly specialized device, likely inserted into the reactor's exhaust vent or a maintenance port. This device, triggered by the remotely initiated pressure fluctuations, would have released a catalyst, a tiny burst of a reactive agent into the altered atmosphere inside the reactor. The energy surge then provided the ignition. The accident was a precisely choreographed ballet of destruction. First, the subtle atmospheric manipulation. Then, the internal priming of the reactor. Finally, the targeted energy surge, igniting the catalyst within the compromised environment. The result, a localized explosion, powerful enough to rupture the containment field and create the illusion of a catastrophic malfunction, but contained enough to leave the surrounding lab relatively intact, masking the true cause. I leaned back, the chair groaning under my weight. My mind raced, reconstructing the scene in vivid detail. The killer hadn't just understood Thorne's research. They had anticipated every variable, every safety measure. They hadn't just breached the lab. They had re-engineered it, turning its own sophisticated systems against its creator. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a statement, a calculated, cold-blooded execution designed to look like a tragic misstep. And the person capable of such an intricate, multi-stage manipulation, triggered remotely with such precision, had to be someone intimately familiar with Thorne's bespoke systems, his unique experimental protocols, and the volatile nature of his groundbreaking work. The implications chilled me to the bone, and they were still out there. I stared at the glowing lines of code on the monitor in the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite, a sterile expanse of steel and muted gray where the only vibrant colors came from indicator lights and digital readouts. The air hummed with the quiet thrum of servers and the low, steady whir of cooling fans, a constant soundtrack to my days. On the workbench beside me, Thorne's primary workstation sat disassembled, its drives connected to my forensic recovery rig. The hit I'd found wasn't a gaping hole, not a clumsy hack. It was a single, meticulously crafted line of script, buried deep within a routine system update protocol, a ghost in the machine. This wasn't an attempt to steal data directly. The script didn't exfiltrate files. It established a dormant, encrypted tunnel, a remote access point that could be activated and deactivated with surgical precision. Whoever did this didn't want to leave a trace of data transfer, only the potential for it. They wanted control. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the digital breadcrumbs. The remote access had been briefly activated just hours before the lab explosion, and again, for a fleeting 30 seconds, during the explosion. Why? What could be done in such a short window? I leaned back, rubbing the grit from my eyes. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow, making the room feel even colder. This wasn't about stealing Thorne's research for profit, not in the way I first imagined. If the killer wanted the groundbreaking bioengineering data, they could have simply copied it or demanded it. The method, the sheer complexity of orchestrating a remote, timed system override to trigger a staged accident, suggested a motive far more intricate. It was an act of prevention, not acquisition. Someone didn't want Thorne's work stolen. They wanted it destroyed, along with him. They wanted to ensure it never saw the light of day, or at least not in the way Thorne intended. The thought solidified in my mind, a chilling anchor. The killer wasn't just after Thorne's research. They were trying to prevent its completion, or more likely, its public release. This wasn't about competitive advantage. It was about suppression. I pivoted, pulling up the recovered data from Thorne's secondary, encrypted drive. It was a mirror image of his primary, but with several partitions I hadn't been able to access yet. The encryption was robust, a layered defense Thorne had clearly spent considerable effort on. He was a man who valued his privacy, and now I understood why. If his work was so dangerous that someone would go to these lengths to stop him, what else was he hiding? Hours blurred into a relentless cycle of algorithms and brute force attempts. Then a small green indicator flashed. A sector of the drive, previously impenetrable, yielded. A new folder appeared on the directory tree, Project Chimera Ethical Review. I clicked it open, a knot forming in my stomach. Inside wasn't a single document, but a series of time-stamped log entries, journal style, written in Thorne's own distinctive, academic prose. The first entry was dated 6 months prior. Thorne expressed growing unease. He detailed his initial excitement, then his sudden realization about the potential for weaponization of his discoveries. He wrote of a new, unforeseen application of his bioengineering principles, one that could be twisted into something truly catastrophic. He described clandestine meetings, veiled threats, and the increasing pressure from an unnamed entity. As I scrolled down, the entries became more frantic, more desperate. He detailed how his original research, intended for medical breakthroughs, had been subtly redirected, its core principles co-opted. And then the name appeared, OmniCorp. My breath hitched. OmniCorp. Thorne wrote of discovering that OmniCorp wasn't just funding his public research. They were secretly bankrolling a separate, more dangerous project using his foundational work, twisting it into something he hadn't intended. He had stumbled upon evidence, encrypted communications, financial transfers to shell companies that proved OmniCorp was developing a bioagent, a designer pathogen, using his genetic sequencing breakthroughs as its blueprint. His final entries were a desperate plea, a declaration of intent. He planned to expose OmniCorp's clandestine funding, to reveal their unethical practices and the horrifying implications of this Project Chimera. He knew it was risky, that his life might be in danger, but he felt a moral imperative. He had compiled all his evidence, prepared to go public. My gaze snapped back to the network logs, the brief, 30-second remote access during the explosion. It wasn't about triggering the accident. It was about ensuring that this specific data, Thorne's ethical concerns, and his intent to expose OmniCorp, was wiped clean from his primary system, leaving only the staged accident as the narrative. The sterile air of the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite suddenly felt suffocating. This wasn't just a murder case anymore. It was something far bigger, far more dangerous. Thorne hadn't just been killed, he'd been neutralized. And I was holding the very evidence OmniCorp had gone to such extraordinary lengths to bury. The tension in the room thickened, a palpable weight pressing down on me. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had just stepped into a war I hadn't even known existed. The glowing lines of code on the monitor in the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite still held my gaze, a digital tapestry woven with the last thoughts of Aris Thorne. The air hummed with the quiet thrum of servers and the low, steady whine of cooling fans, a constant, unobtrusive soundtrack to the meticulous dissection of data. My fingers, still stained faintly with the residue of a chemical indicator from the lab, hovered over the keyboard. I'd been here for hours, the sterile expanse of steel and muted gray feeling less like an examination suite and more like a solitary confinement cell for my own racing thoughts. The initial analysis of Thorne's digital footprint had been a maze of encryption and compartmentalized files, but the fragments I'd recovered, particularly the communication logs with OmniCorp, were starting to coalesce into something coherent. It wasn't just a lab accident, I knew it in my gut, confirmed by the burn patterns and the microscopic residue I'd found. This was a surgical strike, executed by someone who understood Thorne's work intimately, someone who could navigate his highly customized security protocols as if they'd helped design them. I pulled up the comprehensive database of OmniCorp employees who had ever interacted with Thorne's project, cross-referencing it with the lab's access logs. Thousands of names, thousands of roles. Too broad, I needed to filter. My criteria was stringent. Individuals with documented expertise in the specific bioengineering protocols Thorne was developing. A deep understanding of the lab's unique security architecture and, crucially, access to the facility around the time of the incident. The system churned, sifting through resumes, project assignments, and digital footprints. The list shortened dramatically. From thousands, it dwindled to dozens. I scrolled through them, profile after profile, senior researchers, security consultants, IT specialists. Most were predictable, their expertise aligning with their stated roles. But as I clicked through, a name began to surface with unsettling frequency in the access logs, often appearing just before or after Thorne himself. David Thorne, the OmniCorp liaison. No relation, I'd been told, just a coincidence of surnames. I'd met him briefly at the scene, polished, impeccably dressed, radiating an air of corporate authority. He'd offered condolences, talked about the tragic loss to science. He seemed, at the time, genuinely concerned. But now, his profile stood out. I clicked on his detailed record. His primary role was listed as Corporate Liaison Strategic Projects, a title vague enough to cover almost anything. But beneath the innocuous corporate facade, the deeper dive into his past assignments and training records began to paint a different picture. My brow furrowed as I read. Project management, yes. Legal frameworks, of course. But then, tucked away, almost an afterthought, were entries for advanced risk mitigation, proprietary data protection, and international asset recovery. My fingers paused midair. Those weren't standard corporate liaison skill sets. I delved deeper into the advanced risk mitigation section. The subcategories were even more revealing: covert surveillance countermeasures, disruptive technology neutralization, executive protection protocols. This wasn't just corporate security. This was the language of intelligence agencies, of black ops. My eyes widened, a prickle of unease tracing its way up my spine. This man wasn't just a suit, he was a specialist, a ghost. A memory surfaced from the initial briefings, a passing comment from the detective about a past scandal, years ago, involving stolen intellectual property from a rival firm. It had been hushed up, settled out of court, but whispers had persisted of a highly sophisticated, inside job. I cross-referenced David Thorne's employment timeline with the dates of that scandal. He was indeed employed by OmniCorp at the time, and his profile showed a sudden, rapid ascent through the ranks immediately following the incident, coinciding with the establishment of a new strategic asset protection division. He'd been instrumental in its formation. The pieces clanked into place with a sickening certainty. David Thorne, the polite, concerned liaison, wasn't just familiar with Thorne's work. He was trained to understand, protect, and if necessary, neutralize anything deemed a threat to OmniCorp's interests. He had the technical acumen to grasp the intricacies of Aris Thorne's bioengineering, the operational background to bypass sophisticated security, and a proven history of involvement in clandestine operations related to intellectual property. The motive was starting to crystallize. Aris Thorne's groundbreaking research, potentially world-changing, but also potentially disruptive to OmniCorp's established dominance. The quiet hum of the servers now felt less like a backdrop and more like a low, warning growl. This wasn't just a smart killer, this was a professional, a shadow operative working within the gleaming corporate structure. I wasn't hunting a frustrated academic or a greedy rival scientist. I was hunting an inside man, someone with the skills to make a death look like an accident and disappear back into the system without a trace. And he was still out there, watching, waiting, likely calculating his next move. My gaze drifted back to the corporate liaison's profile picture, his smile now seeming less reassuring and more like a carefully constructed mask. I had a prime suspect, and he was dangerous. The hum of the air filtration system was the loudest sound in the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite, a sterile counterpoint to the quiet storm brewing in my mind. I leaned over a workstation, a holographic projection of Aris Thorne's final data set shimmering above the console. My colleague, a meticulous data analyst, was beside me, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We're going with the neural interface theory," I stated, my voice low. "Just loud enough to carry. Tell the press liaison we've found definitive proof of a direct brain-computer interface in Aris's last project. Something that could revolutionize cognitive enhancement. A real breakthrough." The analyst glanced at me, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "But Reed, that's not what the data suggests. Not entirely. It's a component, yes, but the true implications are far more volatile." I nodded slowly, my gaze fixed on the glowing data. "Precisely. We'll leak this version, make it sound like a benign, world-changing medical advance, something too valuable to let fall into the wrong hands, and make sure the corporate liaison hears it. Directly, casually." My colleague caught my meaning then, a knowing glint replacing her confusion. She understood the bait I was dangling. Aris's research wasn't about benign cognitive enhancement. It was about something far more dangerous, something the corporate liaison and their shadowy employers would have gone to extreme lengths to suppress. The true breakthrough was in bioweapon development, and the neural interface was just one component. If the corporate liaison thought we were about to announce a different kind of breakthrough, one that still implied Aris's work was viable and still being examined, they'd panic. They'd have to act. I watched the analyst move away, heading towards the door, presumably to relay the update to the appropriate channels. My jaw tightened. It was a gamble, but the previous chapter's deep dive into the corporate liaison's advanced risk mitigation profile had solidified my suspicions. Disruptive technology neutralization wasn't a standard corporate skill. It was a killer's skill set. Just as I anticipated, it wasn't long before the corporate liaison arrived, gliding into the examination suite with that practiced smooth composure. They offered a polite, almost too rehearsed smile to the uniformed officer at the door, then turned their attention to me. "Reed," the corporate liaison began, their voice a calm, modulated tone. "I heard some interesting developments. My organization is eager to ensure the integrity of Dr. Thorne's legacy. Any breakthroughs, especially those with such profound implications, require the utmost security." I straightened up, turning from the console, my hands clasped behind my back. "Indeed, we're being very thorough. This neural interface research, it's quite something. We're working on isolating some of the more sensitive components, just to confirm the structural integrity, you understand." I gestured vaguely at a secure storage unit across the room, where a few sealed evidence containers sat. It was a bluff, of course. Those containers held benign samples. The real, crucial evidence was already secured elsewhere. The corporate liaison's eyes, however, flickered towards the storage unit, a minuscule shift, but I saw it, a predator's focus. They continued to chat, making small talk about the difficulty of maintaining cutting-edge research in a competitive market, all while subtly edging closer to the workstation I'd just left. My internal clock was ticking. I was hoping to review some of the preliminary findings, if you don't mind, the corporate liaison said, their hand already reaching for the console's interface, a casual, almost unconscious movement. Their fingers hovered over the controls, ready to delete, to corrupt, to neutralize. I saw the intent clear as day. They weren't trying to review, they were trying to sabotage. My voice cut through the sterile air, sharp and unyielding. I wouldn't touch that if I were you. The corporate liaison froze, their hand retracting as if burned. The smooth composure cracked, just for a fraction of a second, revealing a flicker of raw alarm. They turned to me, their smile gone, replaced by a strained mask. Reed, I was merely offering assistance. No, you weren't, I stated, stepping forward, closing the distance between us. My gaze bore into theirs, unwavering. You were trying to erase evidence, just like you tried to erase Aris Thorne. The corporate liaison's breath hitched. Their eyes darted around the suite, searching for an escape, a denial, anything. But there was only me and the silent hum of the machines. The polymer, for instance, I continued, my voice low, deliberate. A specific, highly resilient trace polymer, microscopic, almost invisible. We found it on the equipment in Aris's lab, specifically on the components that facilitated the accident. And we found it again in minute quantities. At the scene of the unfortunate incident with the falling scaffolding that almost crushed me. And again, on the malfunctioning ventilation system that nearly asphyxiated a colleague. I paused, letting each word sink in. It's a unique compound, designed for specialized, high-stress environments. A compound that, according to our forensic analysis, is a key component in a prototype security device developed by a subsidiary of Omni Corp. A device you, as a high-ranking corporate liaison with executive protection protocols in your profile, would have had direct access to. The corporate liaison's face had gone pale, their carefully constructed facade crumbling. Their chest rose and fell rapidly. You don't understand, Aris. He was a liability. The words tumbled out, a flood of desperate justification. He found out about the bioweapon development, the faction within Omni Corp. They tasked me. He threatened to expose everything. The project, the funding, the unethical trials. It would have destroyed us, destroyed them. I had to neutralize the threat. It was a clean operation, designed to look like a tragic miscalculation. The neural interface was just a cover, a way to redirect attention from the true nature of his work. They looked at me then, their eyes wide and pleading, stripped bare of all pretense. I was protecting the corporation, protecting the future. I shook my head, the metallic tang of finality in the air. No, I corrected, my voice steady. You were protecting a secret, and you murdered a brilliant man to keep it buried.